Bonjour à tous et bienvenue.
Hello everyone, welcome to this session on accelerating sustainable development. There is one person in this panel that will be speaking English, so for those of you who need headsets, please go and get them. We have with us Cecilia Lopez, former Minister for Agriculture in Colombia. So we have with us Olivier Pastré, one of the pillars of the Cercle des Économistes. He's written multiple books, the last one being From an Economy of Abundance to an Economy of Scarcity, a book that you wrote with Patrick Artus, and which is a reflection on the new economic paradigm. So in our panel, we have Pierre-Etienne Franc. Hello. You are the CEO of Hy24. Your passion is hydrogen, and you will explain how hydrogen could be a key for sustainable development. Hans-Helmut Kurz, hello. Sorry for saying good evening because I am working on the radio for an evening program. You are a professor in Harvard. You are former Director General of Bundesbank. You are German, and you will give us your macroeconomic and European vision of sustainable development. Cheikh Kanté, Minister in charge of the Plan Senegal 2035. You're the envoy of President Macky Sall, and you will tell us how African countries, and in particular Senegal, can prepare for an acceleration in sustainable development. With us, we have Cecilia Lopez. Hello, you're president of CISOE, former Minister for Agriculture of Colombia under the presidency of Gustavo Petro. You took part in many governments, different types of governments, 5 if I'm not mistaken. You will tell us about Latin America and how these countries can accelerate and face the challenge of the acceleration of sustainable development. Paolo Ribotta, hello. You're the general manager of Zurich Insurance in France. You're Italian, and you will give us your European vision of the funding of sustainable development, and you will explain to us the role of insurance policies in the funding of this sustainable development. Olivier, now that I introduced you, please give us 3 paths for reflection to start the discussion. Hello, everyone, and thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Hail, Stephanie. By way of introduction, to 3 points. Obviously, France invented the concept of sustainable development in 1346 with Philippe de Valois, who was the manager of the forests of the kingdom, and he was in charge of supporting the forests of the kingdom and make sure that they were maintained in a proper status. So once again, France was world champion, but I'm joking, in fact. It wasn't always the case. Then in 72, the Club of Rome, the Meadows Report. In 1980, Jacques Ellul with the Think Global, Act Local. And in 97, the Brundtland Report, which we can consider as the birth date of the political concept of sustainable development. I'm not going to take too much time because I know that the speakers, thanks to Stephanie, will sort of boost your morals. But in my opinion, sustainable development is an economic concept which is one of the quote-unquote shittiest, sorry about that expression, in the way that you really don't know what you're talking about when you talk about sustainable development. So if I may quote Luc Ferry, which I don't often do, the expression sings more than it speaks to people. As we can't really define what sustainable development is, except for this panel, and after this panel you will know what it's all about. But if we want to know what it is not, sustainable development is obviously not a panacea, really. It's not the miracle solution. There are so many things at stake, so many goals that weren't reached on time, so that we have to remain extremely modest. Sustainable development is not green growth either. As honestly, if it were green growth, we would know it. Sustainable development is not either something that has short-term impact, and you can only see what sustainable development is over the long term, and we'll talk about the pace of sustainable development. And sustainable development is not a universal force, I must say. Each country has its own history in that field. Universality is not necessarily of the essence. So then we, Stephanie, we structured the organization of the discussion around 3 topics. The 3 topics we feel are most important and which might bring in solutions. First, innovation. Secondly, funding. And 3, pace. Meaning the short term, the long term, what's in between. So much for the structure of the discussions. And once again, this panel is going to be a flagship moment in the Rencontre d'Aix. As for at last, we'll end up defining the concept and the notion, and we'll end up with the right policy to be implemented to please Jean Hervé. So that's the challenge we have, Olivier. 45 minutes to do that. It's a bit short to define what sustainable development is all about. Let's start with innovation, which is a key for sustainable development. Funding is also obviously the essence, and then the pace. First, let's start with innovation. Pierre-Etienne Franc, is hydrogen one of the solutions to accelerate sustainable development? And is innovation an essential tool to develop hydrogen? Well, hydrogen is the, as we say, the last wheel of the dynamic of sustainable development. We started with solar power, wind power years ago. We stood at 400 euros per megawatt per hour. We now end up at 20, so strong development. The third point is cells, batteries, to help decarbonate transportation. And the third point is hydrogen, which is the complement brought by electrons for energies that we don't know how to cover, like heavy transportation or paper paste, paper mills, etc. So hydrogen is an industry that already exists. 100 million tons of hydrogens are prepared every year, manufactured every year, but we have to decarbonate it. But tomorrow we must have the green energy with the electrolysis of water, and also use them for fuel cells in order to decarbonate mobility. Over the past 15 years, we've had the innovation. 80,000 vehicles in the world are hydrogen-based. People don't know it. So it's almost nothing, but 5 years ago there were none. So The water electrolysis is something that has been in existence for a long time. So what we're looking at now is not so much the technology that works, it's reliable, the cost is dropping, but it's the scale. The scaling up, and for that you have two challenges in terms of mindset. You must accept to reason in terms of systems. We're talking about a very different energy model. We used to take a stock and turn it into a flow. That was the past. A stock of raw material turned into a flow. Now this is the reverse. We have a lot of flows and we have to store them and redistribute it. And with hydrogen, you can store abundant sources of energy and from faraway places and take them to places that don't have them. So that's one first thing. And the second mindset issue is at micro level. What is happening now? We see a lot of electrolysis machines, huge ones. Why is it taking so much time? Well, there's some pace, some speed is at stake, but we seem to be afraid of trial and error. In China, you have 150 suppliers of electrolysis. Some started in hydrogen 6 months ago. And when I was talking to my friends here, they say there's even more. So obviously, they're not very reliable, they're not expensive, but they're not efficient, etc. But every time they make one, they learn from their mistakes. So the Chinese are doing what they did for steel, for textile, for batteries and fuel cells. Every time they do something, they market, they make headway as they are very numerous, they can drop the cost, and they learn as they deploy. We must deploy. Let's stop thinking that supreme innovation is going to come from the top. As you learn as you speak. Hans-Helmut Kotz, you're a specialist in monetary policy. What is your vision of innovation? Hello? I'm very happy to be here, which is something that everybody says. I'm particularly happy to be here because I've been friends with Olivier for about 40 years. So it's great to see such great economists here, and I really enjoyed all the discussions. And if I may, I'm going to refer to all these discussions.
French is so terrible, it wouldn't allow. I don't want to butcher your language. Innovation. I would like to make 3 points. The first is
the micro.
I would like what concerns innovation 3 points. A boring economist one, which is, of course, one has to achieve an increase in what economists call total factor productivity. That means you use resources efficiently. Using resources efficiently requires that you have the proper prices. Internalizing any of the bad stuff, which is now resulting from a mispricing of many resources, and the most critical or the biggest externality, as Nicholas Stern called it, is of course greenhouse gas emissions. So total factor productivity is very important. And what Olivier said, I was trying to scribble up what we said. The concept thinks more than it explains. The concept doesn't really exist in terms of political innovation. It does exist for quite a long time in terms of reasoning about that. There was a very important report by Jean-Paul Fitoussi, Amartya Sen, and Joe Stiglitz in 2009, where they basically came up with the strong proposition that we have to go beyond GDP. So this argument of green growth is mainly referring to, very often, to greening GDP growth. But it's a completely underperforming indicator. It doesn't acknowledge for so many things. Let's begin with, doesn't account for anything which is not priced on markets. It does not, it actually takes in defensive expenditures which are wasting resources as increasing welfare. So it's a really improper way of dealing with welfare, known for a very long time. Jim Tobin and Bill Nortos have written about it in the early 1990s, and there's been lots of development. So we need conceptual innovation. And the third point I do think, which is very important, is to think how to measure that, how to address that, and also how to get into a debate, a public debate, which cares for those who are most hurt by it. For example, I heard just before that carbon pricing would be, you have to tell me when I have to stop, that carbon pricing would be an Anglo-Saxon concept. I don't know what Anglo-Saxon or whatever it is. It is, of course, a very economical concept, but it comes with strong distributional consequences. It will, in particular, hurt those in the lower strata of our societies. Hence, if you want to use it, then I would think it's a very important concept to use. You have to think how to deal with ramifications which have societal impacts. Gilets jaunes was some of those societal impacts. Am I too long?
No, you are.
So three innovations: boring economics, total factor productivity. Secondly, coming up with a proper dashboard, because it's multidimensional, lots of objectives. And here I would like to refer what Patrick Gatteux said yesterday. Yes, Patrick said we have to prioritize. So you have
définir des priorités.
You have 270 social development goals. 17 social development goals, 270 indicators. So we have to become clear about the dashboard we are using.
Cheikh Kanté, le Sénégal s'est engagé à augmenter.
Cheikh Kanté, Senegal has committed to increase its share of renewable energy to 40% by 2030 with a funding of 2.3 billion euros. You have written in a book that you just published that Africa has to trace its own path based on its history, its values, and its aspirations. Are you betting on innovation? Yes, absolutely. First of all, let's agree on innovation and think of the destructive creation of Schumpeter. Today, we're talking about hydrogen. Yesterday, it was a candle. Now, this is a basic necessity both for companies and states. Companies that do not invest into in innovation are bound to disappear in a context of huge competition. And the same goes for states. If you do not become proactive and you do not try to satisfy social demand, you're heading for problems. So Senegal, with its Plan Sénégal Émergent, has changed its references in terms of functional planning based on sustainable development, economically viable, socially fair. And when we talk about innovation in terms of energy, in 2012, when President Macky Sall came into power, we had 1,514 megawatt power installed. We had constant energy cuts that could last a whole day. Now we stand at 1,400 megawatts. And more interesting than that, in 2012, to fight against the most unacceptable inequalities, only 1,648 villages were electrified. We electrified 29 villages out of 100, while now we're almost ready to have energy everywhere. We have the largest windmill farm in Africa, and Senegal is not an isolated case. Senegal is part of the world. It is heading for modernity. It has its own processes, its own challenges, in a world where the rupture points are more frequent than stability points. We are working on resource production, accumulation of wealth, and there is a disarticulation of the planetary systems. Today, Africa is the one that is contributing less to climate change, but paying it at the highest price. So we have to have a global innovation, an innovation that will cover the whole planet. And there is a lack of generosity in cooperation, which is why the reason why in my book I developed this principle of social and solidarity economy based on principles of endogenous development, without which an economy couldn't live. Cecilia Lopez, you are a former Minister of Agriculture from Colombia, or under the government of Gustavo Petro. You're no longer part of the government. For your country and for Latin America, but especially in Colombia, you have to make sure that you have peace and at the same time aim at sustainable development. A difficult equation, huh?
Pleasure as a Latin American to be here because Latin America has disappeared from the European discourse. Before going to innovation, I want just to go very fast to 3 points. First, what is sustainable development? It's an agenda that many countries signed in 2016. The first thing I want to say is that being clear, being realistic, at the actual pace, the world will not accomplish the Sustainable Development Agenda by 2030. So we have to be very clear. It's not to be optimistic, it's being realistic. What does that mean? That means that we have to do it in a different way. And then we have to recognize barriers. If we don't identify why we have done wrong things, why we're not accomplishing this agenda, we're not going to move in a positive way. And the third point I want to talk is about mitigation. This is a generalized discourse, and I agree with you, my colleague from Senegal, because this is not the discourse that we developing countries should have. People, where are the people? The people that are the victims, they are contributing very little, as you said, but we are suffering. But you know, the critical thing is that President Petro, President of Colombia, went to Paris and had exactly the same speech that President Macron. Exactly the same speech. The world is going to end because we are not controlling the emissions. And you know what? Our reality in Colombia, in developing countries, is people. We need to reduce poverty and inequality. Otherwise, we won't have sustainable development. So I think this is something that we have to be very critical about. The discourse of developing countries has to be different. Why don't we ask the rich countries, you have to reduce emissions by a certain percent? Why don't we do that? I invite you, Africa and Latin America, let's change our discourse. And now innovation. Innovation, creating new value. You know, what you said, my colleague from Senegal, there is a funding gap. Nobody cares about funding. We have to do in the developing countries an effort to fund, to find resources for innovation. But we are supposed to have a support from the rich countries. You rich countries are doing nothing. Innovation is not being financed. That would be my contribution.
On va revenir sur justement le financement. Paolo Ribotta.
Well, funding, Paolo Ribotta, about innovation. You're an insurer. Innovation means new risks, so I guess it means new policies for insurance companies that have to adapt. Well, hello, everyone. First of all, the role of the insurance sector in innovation is a role that is based on our present specificities. What do? We have to learn and understand what are the risks and quantify these risks, give them a price. It's no use quantifying things if then you do not have the proper system to transfer and manage the risks. The other role of the insurance sector, which is a basic role, is that of acting as a motor, as a driver, to bring the various parties together concerning these risks. So we must combine the global organizations, national organizations, various communities, so that we can not only take the risks, but set up the right plans in order to have a real impact on economies and on the social life. And it's all the more important when you look at the impact of climate change. The impact of climate change, as was very aptly said, are even stronger on a number of countries, like developing countries or countries that have a different situation from the developed countries. And if you look at what happened in Paris in 2015 at COP21, when we launched an insurance forum, which is a forum where all my insurance colleagues and a number of important colleagues get together to try and reach the SDGs of the UN. But the Insurance Development Fund Forum, as its name indicates, is organized around 4 pillars based on commitments and partnerships. The idea is to increase impact through innovation and project execution, and it has also the idea of being a leading influence. And a lot of initiatives have been taken by the Insurance Forum, and I would like to mention one, and my German colleague will probably recognize that, the Tripartite Alliance. It's an organization of the Insurance Development Forum via UNDP and the Sustainable Development Organization. So the idea is to help up to 500 million people benefit in the world in order to transfer the risk, let's say, lift the risks that are weighing on some communities and have them borne by the capital market. So, and we have 5 billion euros available. In 2022, we have 20 countries and 22 projects that are ongoing. And in these 20 countries, 5 projects are already ongoing. 5 projects are in funding phase. And you have the funds? Where do you find the funds to fund this? Yes, we deploy funds and we deploy capacities that are our own. We trust these approaches, and we make these funds available. Today, we have 2.2 billion euros of capacity of risk transfer that are on the table. They're tabled. And there are a lot of projects that are aimed at communities to help reduce the impact of climate events and consequences of climate change on these communities. They're often rural communities or communities in developing countries or in poor countries. So insurance companies have a role to play, and not only my company, but all insurance companies, to federate people around these approaches. Okay, funds, money is at the heart of everything. But who must pay? Do you manage to convince people to pay and invest in hydrogen? Because if I listen to you, we're running late. Should we have a global fund that we can't even, in fact, supply to fund hydrogen?
Well, we have to sketch out a roadmap if the financial institutions are to be roped in. We've done that. We showed them the role of hydrogen in the economy, and now this is widely shared by all countries that want to move forward with the transition. So we have to sketch out the challenges, and then we have the energy transition, of course. We have to multiply by 10 energy expenditure, and then we have to bring people together in development projects. We did that by creating this joint company with Altium and Evacat. We raised an initial amount of 2 billion. That's quite atypical. In the fund, half of the investment come from industry. And had the financiers not followed, they would have done it. The other half is big institutions in financial institutions in France, Germany, the US, and elsewhere, and they wouldn't have joined had we not already roped in industry. Air Liquide, Vinci, all these companies have invested together with us. They put up 100 million, and the fund has created an initial market of 2 billion. We won't capture everything, but that's a scope of 2 billion. And people have minority stakes with others, with state financing, and we're multiplying things by 10 furthermore. In other words, the momentum is there. We're building up a massive money, and we'll be able to accompany sustainable development through major projects. And the last stage is the one we launched thanks to our link between Ardian and others with Club SWEF. We have connected the two worlds, and now all the big sovereign funds are saying, give us the rules. Give us rules of traceability for hydrogen so that the monetization becomes possible, so that we can roll out the infrastructure based on really stringent and proper rules. We need to build up this tempo, and that's the role of public spending as well. Financial institutions, how can they accompany sustainable development? We heard from the boss of the Bank of France. He said we have to focus on inflation, keep it at 2%, we'll succeed. Now, what about the other financial institutions in Europe? Can they accompany sustainable development in light of the indicators you've mentioned? Well, for example,
there's the European Investment Bank, which has been engaged for a very long time in those activities. Here in France, you have BPI. They are also taking care of some of them, but that's completely underperforming in terms of the dimension of the problem. So they're basically two venues. One is public sector, which means budget, which means taxes or debt. Given that we have a significant amount of debt, which might become problematic at a certain point of time, you have to think about taxes. And so carbon tax could be used for that. Pollution permits could be used for that. Though they are not meant primarily to raise revenue, they are thought to be to reorient the allocation of our economies. And I just learned an interesting argument by Jacques Attali. Jacques Attali spoke about it's not about just increasing expenditures, it's also about thinking, of course, he is a poet somehow. He spoke of stuff which is killing us and stuff which is good for us. And he said 50% of what we do in our GDP accounting is la vie morte. Alors, you also need some reorientation. That's why allocation comes in. But it has to be cushioned. You have to take care of those who are poor. And it's not only poor in our societies, because also those in... So the second point, private sector. Just look at the US Investment Reduction Act, which has nothing to do with investment reduction. It's exclusively about launching on a big scale defending the planet, which comes with consequences which are not so nice for us Europeans, but it has a very high multiplier effect. So those 367 billion over 10 years are producing seemingly an effect of 10 times in terms of private sector involvement. So the major part of that will be private sector involvement, and that will be paid by us as consumers because we like the stuff that comes out of that. So two venues, and I think what's this? Recréer l'espoir. I'm not that negative on that. So you can make that.
L'Europe doit faire son...
So Europe must make its own Inflation Reduction Act?
Will do, but you have to think about really... I'm a realist. You have to think about the big nations, what they are doing and how they are doing it in the Council. So it's not so much about those small countries which simply do not have the means. We have to support them. And I yesterday heard money comes from Brussels. There's zero money coming from Brussels, exactly zero. It comes from a few places, and those places have to embark on those initiatives. And if you look at the Jean Pisani-Ferry's report, you see there's lots of good ideas, but you see that also happening in the case of the Netherlands, Centraal Planbureau, or now my small country, Germany. And there's money behind that.
Cheikh Kanté, alors justement, sur cette...
So, in terms of the North, which is financing, yes, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say a few words. The role of members of the Cercle is really to be very frank, even if that displeases people. What François Guénaud said is absolutely ridiculous. He's the only person who believes what he said. What is the right target? We need to move forward because the world economy is in a state of crisis. We should stop being childish. We should stop listening to just any old person. Thank you. Yeah, the North needs to help the South. That's part of the Global Financial Pact. We know that you want Africa to be able to come to grips with the problem, but people say you need to transform the world economic system. Countries in the North must participate. Countries in the South suffer much more from climate change and emit very little CO2. I think we have to destroy certain taboos that penalize Africa. In OECD, people meet every year to allocate a risk coefficient to Africa. There's a risk of about 5%. And insurances, rating agencies add 10 or 15%. That makes 20%. In Europe, when you have a negative rating, -0, that's one thing, but in Africa, we're plus. We have greater risks. When I came to Paris the other day, friends said to me, "You're running a risk. In France, you may be attacked. Don't go to France." And I said, well, I came to France with the Gilets jaunes, and I said, well, this is living democracy, which is the case in Africa and in Europe. So we have this taboo of the OECD. We worked on this together with Professor Lorenzi, and the rating agencies must realize there is no risk in Africa. They should stop increasing the costs of our transactions. When the cost of capital is too high, then projects are killed in the bud. We thought of setting up an African mechanism for financial stability. This mechanism has existed in Europe. It dates back centuries. It dates from William the Orange. And that's likewise, you have something similar in the US. So we need global innovation, global governance. Africa should not continue to suffer from climate change and demographic problems. We have tremendous assets. We have a huge percentage of young people in our population. That's a powerful asset if it's properly used. The European population will drop because Europe has already fallen underneath the renewal threshold in terms of population. So I think we have to take all this into consideration, and we have to take account of the place of Africa in the transition. European countries in the north can't benefit from our fossil fuels and tell us, well, don't emit any CO2 anymore, because the technology behind this transition has not yet been fully understood and brought under control. It's the problem of fossil fuels. But we need, above all, to master the processes of CO2 emissions. You need to limit the production of fossil fuels. That's what people say to us. Well, what's going to happen? Production will drop. Supply and demand will play their part. Countries will increase renewables. Central banks will combat inflation, increase rates, and it's a vicious circle. And the whole world will suffer, not to mention the impact of the war in Ukraine. So innovation is the key. Innovation must be comprehensive and generation in order to kindle hope, and not just hope, so that the whole of the world can hope once again. And the pace is very important, of course. Cecilia Lopez, maybe you'd like to react to what's just been said by Cheikh Conté. It's interesting to see that in your country, I fully agree with what has been said. I do indeed agree with the speakers. But I fear that you're a bit too pessimistic or optimistic. In other words, you criticize, you say the best lies ahead. No, these rating agencies do not want to change. The system is designed in such a way that the South is not financed, or is financed at a cost that has nothing to do with the quality of growth in the South. So we really have to get going. We have to move our asses, in other words. Cecilia Lopez. So we have to really move our asses. That's a radical stance. We have Gustavo Petro, who's banned the exporting of oil. That is quite a radical measure. And how can you finance this in a country like Colombia?
I agree that we cannot just criticize. We really have to contribute to do the agenda together. At least Africa is so lucky that you are in OECD agenda. For Latin America, it's harder. We are considered developing countries in a higher way, which is not right. Africa is, I don't know how you said it in English, is coming very close to Latin America in terms of economic growth. I was very surprised about that. You are growing much more than Latin America as a region. Nobody knows about that, but it is true. We were worried about it. We're happy, but we were worried. Okay, about this, how can we contribute? Financing has two problems. First, lack of funds. We cannot expect only governments and governments from rich countries do what they are supposed to do. Remember Paris Agreement. Developed countries must help developing countries to obtain the sustainable agenda goals. We have to do an effort. Innovation and financing for the innovation and for technical assistance is very low in our countries. That's a thing we have, and we have to make an effort. The second point is we have to call the private sector. Where is the private sector? I'm glad we have representatives here. You have a role to play. Our private sector that is isolated from this debate and the international private sector. But there is another problem. Funds are going to mitigation. They are not going to adaptation. Mitigation, what is mitigation? Just large-scale investment to reduce emissions. That's the rich countries' discourse. Because we, as you said, we are not contributing in a significant way to these emissions. But then, what is adaptation? Adaptation adds significant resources to control the adverse effects of climate change on people. Again, people are behind this debate. They are hidden from this debate. And the problem is that all the funds are going much more to mitigation and very little to adaptation. Of course, national countries have to support that, but we need international support. Why we're not talking about this? I think this is an opportunistic position of developing countries. We talk about mitigation because that is good for your ears, and you have the money. Then we have to change the discourse. We have to really do an effort, not only for adaptation, but also because we have a contribution to mitigation that needs your support. You know what? And I'm talking about Latin America, we have all the minerals that we need for climate change. We need support to be able to bring to the offer, to the supply of the world of these new minerals. And then for that, what do we need? We need transition. What does that mean? Time. You are not giving us time. That's something that developing countries need for sustainable development. Time.
Du temps, il faut. Paolo Ribotta, alors les assureurs justement, d'après ce qu'a dit Cheikh Kanté, pour l'Afrique quand même.
Paolo Ribotta, on the insurers side, I don't know. But insurers have a part to play. There's a major challenge to tackle. A number of interesting things are currently being done, and we are contributing as an insurance sector. We've talked about mitigation here. I'm talking only for the sector in which I am. We're making considerable efforts. As a financial lever, we are investors like other financial institutions. But over and beyond that, we also play a part in raising funds and capital to be able to finance a certain number of plans and programs. We also have an approach which is well developed when it comes to prevention, the prevention of risks, risk control, risk management. We have some very concrete examples in this area. I'm referring to an initiative which was launched by my group in 2018, and it's called Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. Flooding between 2010 and 2019, well, about 670,000 people in the world were affected. Million people around the world were affected. And this is bound to increase given climate change. Flooding will increase. We've always thought, and we are truly ambitious in this area, that when there is a flood, everyone suffers, the economy comes to a halt. And we have a vision which consists in saying, when there's a flood, countries, communities, people should be in a position not only to continue working, but they should be able to continue to flourish. They should be able to continue despite the impact of the flooding. You can do a number of practical things to this end. And that's important for people who are affected by these floods. We have, in our alliance, we have included a certain number of outside entities that do research work because our raw material is data. And using data, we have searchers together with other kinds of professionals who are setting up prevention plans. A prevention plan is based on data, and data is mathematical. The idea then is to enable communities facing floods to anticipate the risk. We want to prevent the risk. The idea is to create behaviors so that when there is a flood, and flooding is bound to happen, the impact of the flood will be much less great. And once we've done that, and we really worked hard on this matter, we have tried to lend credibility to this approach. With this credibility, thanks to this approach, we went to see the decision makers, the financiers, people financing the investment, and we said, well, here we are. We have these people, these communities that are credible. They already know how to react in the case of flooding. And the people putting up the finance, we went to see them, plus the policy decision makers, the idea being to create the tools to boost investment. So I think prevention and the certification and the changing of behavior can play a really important part, because these communities can then become more credible vis-à-vis the people putting up the funds. We only have 6 minutes left. Insurers play a marginal role. because they only react based on the information given them. You say to an insurer now, in this area there's a risk, the insurer may react simply by including the risk in the plan. In Dakar, under Jean-Hervier Christian, we have given thought to the Dakar Consensus with 7 paradigms: mobilize internal and external resources, good governance. We have to prevent shocks, but in a realistic manner. We have to create partnerships, use raw materials. The perception of risk doesn't exist sufficiently, and global governance must change so that Africa has a greater part to play. $560 million in investment were granted to specific projects. And this money would not have arrived had we not adopted this approach to boost credibility. Cecilia Lopez, did you want to add something?
We want to really change and get the sustainable development agenda. One sentence: discourse. Too much discourses.
No.
Very little action. We need action, both in developed and developing countries. And the second thing I want to say is why we demand time. Because we have to move, we have to make a productive transformation. Colombia has 50% of their exports come from oil and coal. If we want to move to a sustainable development, we need time to do that. Please, European community, allow us to sell our new products so we can make a transition. We need that you give us time.
Donc vous n'êtes pas d'accord avec votre président qui...
So you don't agree with your president who has banned exports of oil? That was one of his goals.
Stop the exploitation of oil immediately. It's impossible. You have to make a transition. You have to stimulate the agricultural sector. I can talk as the former Minister of Agriculture. That is a lot of potential. But you know what you're doing in Europe? You're asking us to stop deforestation. Otherwise, we cannot export fruits to here. You're our market. We cannot do it in 1 month. We need time.
Du temps pour les
Time for hydrogen too. We have to speed up, in other words, hydrogen. The regulation has to be validated so that thousands of projects can finally be decided on. I'd like to say 2 things: the pace, the speed. Like in a concert, we have to manage different scores. We have to manage the fact that if you take Africa, well, CO2 emissions, that's less than 1 ton a year per African. In any case, they will want to use fossil fuels to improve standards of living. Yet we, at the same time, we have to go from 6 to 7 tons per inhabitant per year, or 15 in the US, to 2. So we have to use much less energy. So it's a total difference. There's another very fundamental issue. We have to go extremely fast to change our use of energy. And at the same time, we have to work in symbiosis so that the resources we use can regenerate. We have to learn to live more slowly. The pace of growth is exponential, and that no longer works. What do you mean by that? In other words, we have to go fast to change our model and accept that our concept of growth and wealth, all this should change radically in our developed countries. So you're in favor of degrowth? No. It's a very different kind of growth in terms of its components. It should be less correlated with energy, otherwise we'll hit a brick wall. It's because of energy that we can move, heat our homes. We can't do without energy completely. 2 or 3 very quick points. I've been interested in the matter for about 30 years now, and I have learned a very great deal from reinsurers.
So I side to a significant degree with Paolo, because the price signals they send do have allocative consequences going forward. Second point, we have to think about not the private sector only doing this. It is industrial policy which we need in terms of orienting, because we are speaking of common goods, public goods, where you have too much of free riding going on, and basic research won't be done by by the private sector. So we have to think about industrial policy and don't shy away with that, and just look at the case of the IRA. And that's my last remark. The IRA was also about how to socially embed and cushion the transformation. So that's what Heather Bushy said just 2 days ago.
Ok, Olivier, tu conclus?
Olivier, would you like to draw a conclusion?
Allow me a final sentence.
The final sentence.
Is there a real solidarity between the North and the South to accomplish this agenda of climate change?
Olivier, il y a une solidarité entre...
Olivier, is there solidarity between North and South? Well, the answer is in the question. Of course there is. That's not an issue. Now, I would just like to draw a few conclusions. All the speakers have been wonderful, and I think the room can thank you all. It was wonderful. We have stuck to our commitments. We have pretty much defined sustainable development. Look at the report of the discussion, and you will see that we've achieved quite tangible results in terms of answering these questions. And then as to the three subjects, financing, the duration, sustainability, there also, I think, we have talked about economic and political solutions, which don't all converge, but at least everything was pretty consistent. So I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank the audience. I'd like to thank Stephanie. Thank you to you all.